On a brisk November day in 1985, an 11-year-old boy playing in the woods of Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, stumbled upon a large metal barrel. Curious, he and his friends pried it open, only to be driven back by an overpowering, putrid odor. Startled and unsure what they had found, the children tipped the barrel over and fled, unaware that they had just unearthed the first grim clues in a mystery that would haunt families and investigators for decades. Inside that rusted 55-gallon drum lay the remains of a young woman and a little girl, discarded like they were trash in the chilly New England woods. It was a discovery that sent shockwaves through the small community and marked the beginning of one of America's most perplexing cold cases. Little did anyone know that this gruesome find was only part of a cross country trail of murder and deception left by a man of many faces. He was a drifter, an imposter who moved from coast to coast under different names, seamlessly blending into new communities while leaving tragedy in his wake. Law enforcement dubbed him the Chameleon Killer for his ability to assume new identities and hide in plain sight. His real name was Terry Peder Rasmussen, but over the years, he was known variously as Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Gordon Jensen, Larry Vanner, and several others. For decades, he evaded justice by slipping in and out of lives, a handyman, a boyfriend, a father, and then he would vanish before anyone could grasp the horror he carried within him. And today we are breaking down it all. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I post a few videos every single week on one of these topics, so if you're into this sort of thing, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. And without further ado, let's jump right into today's case. Terry Peder Rasmussen was born on December 23rd, 1943, in Denver, Colorado. He grew up in Arizona, where he attended North High School in Phoenix before dropping out in his sophomore year in 1960. Those who knew him in his youth likely saw nothing extraordinary, just another boy in a middle class family. At 18, he enlisted in the United States Navy in April 1961 and trained as an electrician. He served for 6 years until July 1967 and gained skills that would later help him find work wherever he drifted. Now, after leaving the Navy, he moved to Hawaii, where his parents had a shoe shop and worked there for some time. In July of 1968, at the age of 24, he married a woman he met in Hawaii. The young couple eventually settled in Phoenix, Arizona, and by 1969, they welcomed twin daughters. Rasmussen would then find employment as an electrician, a trade he'd picked up in the Navy, and worked for an electrician boss named Odo in Phoenix. The growing family soon moved to Redwood City, California in 1970, where Rasmussen continued to work as an electrician in Palo Alto. There, they had a son in 1970 and another daughter in 1972. So, by all outward appearances, Terry Rasmussen in the early 70s was a regular husband and father of four, trying to make a living. But behind closed doors, darkness was already seeping in. His wife and children would later recall that Rasmussen was volatile and physically abusive, at one point burning his son with cigarette butts in a horrific act of discipline. The facade of a normal family life started to crack. In 1972, Rasmussen's marriage hit turbulence. He and his wife separated for some time, perhaps a consequence of his abuse or other strains in their relationship. They did end up reconciling very briefly, but in 1973, Rasmussen decided to move the family back to Phoenix, Arizona. He then picked up work again with his former boss, Odo, and also in a local shoe shop. However, Trouble with the law would soon emerge. In April 1973, Rasmussen was arrested by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office in Arizona. The exact circumstances of that arrest remain unclear in public records, but it was an early sign of a growing criminal inclination. Then, in June of 1975, he was arrested again in Phoenix, this time for aggravated assault. The second arrest was the breaking point for his family. It's believed that soon after this 1975 incident, his wife finally decided that she had had enough and she was going to leave him and take the children with her. The man who had once been her husband and the father of her kids was now someone she needed to escape from for all of their safety. That Christmas season of 1975, the estranged Rasmussen made one last unsettling visit to see his family. In December 1975, or possibly even earlier in 1976, he arrived unexpectedly at his wife's home in Arizona. To the surprise of his relatives, he was not alone. Rasmussen brought along an unidentified woman and introduced her as his girlfriend. He gave very few details about his life, only mentioning that he was living in Ingleside, Texas at the Casa del Rey apartments. The visit was very brief and very awkward. The family hadn't seen him in months, and now he appeared out of the blue with a mystery woman by his side. After that encounter, Rasmussen's first family literally never saw him again. He basically abandoned his wife and four children. In 1978, their divorce was finalized in absentia. He'd vanished from their lives, seemingly for good. Unbeknownst to his wife and children, Terry Rasmussen, as they knew him, was about to completely disappear. He was preparing to shed his identity entirely and embark on a nomadic life that would span the entire country. He had the skills of an electrician, a penchant for traveling, and now no familial ties to hold him back. Well, as he saw it. Over the next few years, he roamed through Arizona, Colorado, California, Idaho, Virginia, Texas, Ohio, Oregon, and even Hawaii, before finally settling in New Hampshire in the late 70s. Each new locale was a chance to reinvent himself, and he often did. He became a proficient liar and imposter, adopting new names and backstories as easily as changing shirts. His training made it easy to find short term work on oil rigs in Texas or at a mill job in New Hampshire, and his lack of roots made it really easy for him to disappear when he needed to. By the end of the 70s, Rasmussen had begun to construct the false identities that would allow him to operate undetected. In June 1978, records show him working under an alias in Houston, Texas at the Brown and Root Company, an engineering and construction firm related to the oil industry. But he abruptly quit that job, telling colleagues that he was going to work elsewhere. And later that year, he contacted an old friend in Arizona asking for money, claiming that he was on an oil rig in Texas and down on his luck. But Texas wouldn't be his final destination. Sometime in 1978 or 79, Rasmussen drifted far from the Southwest and resurfaced in New Hampshire, nearly 2,000 miles away, under a new name. In New Hampshire, he introduced himself as Robert T. Evans, often just Bob Evans. He posed as Bob Evans and settled in the city of Manchester and found employment as the head electrician at the Wambeck Mill, a local manufacturing mill. To workers and neighbors, Bob Evans might have just seemed like a skilled tradesman and perhaps a drifter, but nothing immediately flagged him as a wanted man. He was still in his mid 30s, and he was described by some who met him later as having, quote, twinkly blue eyes and a disarming charm. Yet he could appear quite different at times. Sometimes clean cut and polite, other times unkempt with a scruffy beard, even affecting Southern or East Coast accents at will. This chameleon like ability to alter his looks and persona made him really difficult to pin down. And underneath that friendly or unassuming exterior, Bob Evans was dangerous. It wasn't long before Bob had his first run ins with New Hampshire law. In early 1980, he was arrested 3 times in Manchester under that very alias. In February 1980, he was charged with issuing a bad check after bouncing a check that previous December. In May 1980, he was arrested for the theft of services, essentially stealing utilities by tapping into an electrical supply. And in October of that same year, he faced yet another charge for diverting electrical currents, a continuation of the utility theft issue from before. Now, these started off as relatively small time offenses, but they established that Bob Evans was living on the fringes even as he worked a steady job. Each time he managed to get out of jail quickly, paying his fines or serving brief stints. And no one at the time connected Bob Evans to the name Terry Rasmussen. He was just another local troublemaker as far as the Manchester police were concerned. While living in New Hampshire, Bob Evans wasn't just a solitary bachelor. On some paperwork, including one of his arrest forms, he actually listed a wife, Elizabeth Evans. Police now believe that this was a lie, an alias likely assigned to a woman who was traveling with him. So, who was Elizabeth Evans? She was never located, and no legitimate marriage record exists at all. Investigators suspect that Elizabeth may have been Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, a young woman Bob Evans was dating at the time. Honeychurch's middle name was Elizabeth, which would fit, and she was indeed with him in New Hampshire during this period. But this identity has never been definitively confirmed, as Marlisle Honeychurch wasn't found alive to clarify the truth. In retrospect, the mention of a wife named Elizabeth in 1980 was one of many red flags that only made sense decades later. It hinted that Rasmussen, acting as Bob Evans, had a woman with him. She was likely one of his victims, even as he moved to yet another alias and a crime. By late 1981, he was still masquerading around as Bob Evans and was involved with a 23-year-old woman in New Hampshire named Denise Beaudin. Now, Denise was from nearby Goffstown and had a baby daughter from a previous relationship. The little girl was about 6 months old in the autumn of 1981, and Denise and Bob Evans were dating steadily by that time. Around Thanksgiving 1981, Denise decided to introduce Bob to her family. Now, not much is recorded about that holiday encounter, but shortly afterwards, Denise Beaudin vanished. In late November 1981, Denise, her baby daughter, and Bob Evans all disappeared from Manchester, seemingly departing together in a hurry. Her family did not initially report her missing. They recalled that the young couple had been struggling financially and assumed that Denise had left town to start fresh elsewhere, possibly to avoid creditors who might have been after her. Quote, apparently they had had some financial difficulties, so that was the assumption, that they were kind of running from their financial woes, unquote. This is what Manchester Police Captain Ryan Grant would say years later. But tragically, the Beaudin family assumption meant that no missing person report was ever filed for Denise. It was a decision that allowed Rasmussen to hide her fate for decades longer. In truth, authorities now believe that Bob Evans, aka Rasmussen, murdered Denise sometime after leaving New Hampshire with her in 1981. It's suspected the crime occurred in California, where he soon resurfaced, though Denise's remains have never been found. What we do know is that Rasmussen did not harm Denise's infant daughter. He took the baby with him across the country, using her as almost a prop to bolster whatever new identity he would assume. In the cruelest irony, he became the abductor of a child he had no relation to. And for the next few years, this little girl would be dragged along in Rasmussen's nomadic and dangerous life. While Bob Evans was establishing himself in New Hampshire, a horrific crime was unfolding in the shadows, one that would not fully come to light until years later. In November 1985, a hunter in Bear Brook State Park near the small town of Allenstown, New Hampshire, came across a tipped-over steel drum not far from a dirt access road. Inside were the remains of two females, one adult woman in her 20s or early 30s, and one young girl around 10 years old. The bodies were badly decomposed. They'd been dead for several years. Investigators noted signs of blunt force trauma to their heads. They'd been bludgeoned to death. The discovery of a woman and child murdered and left in a barrel shocked the community, and it puzzled police. Who were they? Who could have killed a woman and a little girl and then dumped them in the woods? Now, at the time, despite nationwide checks of missing persons reports, the two victims remained unidentified. They became known simply as the Allenstown or Bear Brook Jane Does. Local police and the state forensic examiners tried to glean clues. The barrel itself was a 55-gallon industrial drum, the kind used for chemicals, not something typically found in the middle of the forest for no reason. And the location was adjacent to a mobile home park on private property that was next to the state park, but it wasn't a spot many hikers would randomly venture. Whoever left that barrel there likely had some familiarity with the area. Residents were really uneasy knowing that a killer had used their woods as a dumping ground, but without identities or obvious suspects, the case just went closed. But what no one realized in 1985 was that this barrel was only half of the puzzle. Nearly 15 years later, in May 2000, an investigator revisiting the cold case in Allenstown decided to scour the area again. And incredibly, a second barrel was found about 100 yards from the first site. Inside this drum were the skeletal remains of two little girls, much younger than the first child. These two were estimated to be between 2 and 4 years old and 1 to 3 years old at the time of death. It appeared that they had been killed at the same time as the first two victims in the late 70s or early 80s, and then just left in a separate barrel that had gone unnoticed for years. The realization was chilling. The killer hadn't just killed a woman and one child. There were 4 victims in total, likely a woman and 3 children, all found within a few football fields of each other in steel drums. New Hampshire authorities were now dealing with a serial killer, and one that had targeted a family. For years, the Bear Brook Murders, as they came to be known, frustrated and haunted investigators. Here were 4 victims with no names and no known connections to the area. DNA testing in the early 2000s did provide one clue, though. It showed that 3 of the victims, the adult woman and 2 of the girls, they were related. The woman was the mother of the oldest girl found, but also the youngest girl found. The middle girl, the one who was between 2 and 4 years old, didn't share the same maternal DNA. She was not the woman's child, but intriguingly, she was related to the killer. Analysis showed she was the biological daughter of an unknown father. This suggested that the killer might have been her father. It was a tantalizing hint at the perpetrator's identity, but without a suspect to compare it to, it just remained that, a hint. All the while, families in other parts of the country were searching for loved ones who had vanished around that time. Unbeknownst to them, their answers lay in those barrels in New Hampshire. Now you're about to recognize this name. One such family was that of Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. Marlise was a 24-year-old mother of 2 young girls. Originally from Connecticut, Marlise had moved to California in the 70s. She had been married and divorced twice and had a daughter from each marriage, Marie Vaughn, born in 1971, and Sarah McWaters, born in 1977. In late 1978, Marlise began dating a man who called himself Terry. And you guessed it, it's none other than Terry Rasmussen, although her family did not know him by any name at the time. Around Thanksgiving in 1978, Marlise brought this new boyfriend and her daughters to her mother's house in La Puente, California for a holiday gathering. That visit did not end well. Apparently, Marlise and her mom had an argument, according to Marlise's sister, Paula Hodges. Quote, my mom might have said something to her like, he's too old for you. Why are you with him? Unquote. And indeed, Rasmussen was 35 at the time. He was 10 years older than Marlise and didn't really make a good impression with the family. Upset by the family conflict, Marlise made a fateful decision. She decided to gather Marie, 6, and Sarah, 1, and left that very day with Rasmussen, promising to be in touch later. They were never to be seen by her family. For years, Marlise's family searched for her and the girls. Her brother, David Solomon, remembered how desperately they tried to track them down. Quote, it was just a situation where every time we searched, we came to a dead end, came to a dead end, came to a dead end, he said. Marlise's mother intuitively felt that something was wrong. The family hired a private investigator at one point, but that got them nowhere. They had absolutely no idea that Marlise had actually traveled across the country with Rasmussen. After the argument in late 1978, Rasmussen likely convinced Marlise to go to New Hampshire with him for a fresh start. She probably had no way of knowing his violent potential. And tragically, evidence suggests that Marlise, Marie, and Sarah were murdered not long after that Thanksgiving 1978 departure. The woman and the oldest child found in the first barrel in 1985 were Marlise and 8-year-old Marie, and the youngest child found in the second barrel in 2000 was 2-year-old Sarah. At the time of her death, Marlise was only about 26 years old. The knowledge that she and her little girls had been killed and left in a forest far from home was beyond comprehension for her siblings. The family had spent so long wondering and worrying, only to learn the horrifying truth decades later. Marlise and her daughters didn't simply drop off the grid. They were victims of a calculating killer. And what of the third little girl, the one unrelated to Marlise? Well, this child, the one later called the middle child in the Bear Brook case, was, as that DNA proved, the biological daughter of Terry Rasmussen. Investigators now know her name as Rhea Rasmussen, born in 1976 in California. Her mother was a woman named Pepper Elizabeth Reed, originally from Texas, born in 1952. Pepper Reed had apparently been involved with Rasmussen in the mid 1970s. Quite possibly, she was the unidentified girlfriend that he randomly showed up with at his family's house in 1975, and she must have given birth to their daughter Rhea in 1976. Both Pepper and little Rhea disappeared by the late 70s. It's now presumed that Rasmussen also murdered Pepper Reed somewhere along the line, making her another likely victim whose body has never been recovered. Baby Rhea was perhaps kept by her father for a time, but ultimately, he showed no mercy to his own flesh and blood. She was one of the 2 children found in that second barrel. His daughter was just 2 to 4 years old when he snuffed out her life. For more than 30 years, the Bear Brook victims remained Jane Does. Their killer walked free and unsuspected, having assumed yet new identities elsewhere. The case grew colder, and the community of Allenstown lived under the pall of an unsolved mystery. The thought of those little girls and their mom left in barrels in the woods horrified anyone who knew about it. And yet, for decades, no one had any idea who they were or who had killed them. Today, we know that Rasmussen was the prime suspect in the Bear Brook murders, and indeed, all evidence points to him as the perpetrator. But crucially, during his lifetime, Rasmussen was never charged or tried for these murders. It was not until advancements in DNA technology and investigative work decades later that he was conclusively linked to the crime in 2017. By then, he was dead. The Bear Brook case stands as a haunting example of how a serial killer's actions can reverberate through time. How one man's violent spree can destroy multiple families and confound law enforcement until the truth would finally emerge piece by piece. By the early 1980s, Terry Rasmussen, having left a trail of tragedy in New Hampshire, found refuge on the West Coast once more. In the spring of 1984, he surfaced in California under yet another false name. This time, he went by Curtis Mayo Kimball. As Kimball, he was hired in March 1984 as an electrician at an electrical company in Los Alamitos, California, in Orange County. He worked there for over a year, presumably keeping a low profile. One can imagine him as a somewhat transient worker, skilled enough to do the job, but not someone who built deep roots or friendships. He likely had a little girl in tow and passed her off as his daughter. And indeed, the child that he had taken from New Hampshire, Denise Beaudin's daughter, was still with him, now a toddler of 2 or 3 years old. And although I'm grateful he's not killed this little girl, it makes me wonder what was the difference between this one and the others that he killed. I'm so curious to know how he determined who to give mercy to and who he just tossed aside like garbage. But in May 1985, Curtis Kimball had a brush with the law. He was arrested in Cypress, California, for driving under the influence and endangering the welfare of a child. The child in question was Lisa, the name Rasmussen used for Denise's daughter. This arrest is a revealing moment. It shows that even in California, his irresponsibility and criminal behavior continued. He was driving drunk with a toddler in the car and obviously put her at risk. After being taken into custody for the DUI, he was supposed to appear in court, but Curtis Kimball jumped bail and he just fled. He had no intention of sticking around to face charges that would expose all of his lies. This incident also suggests that authorities briefly had Rasmussen and the little girl in their grasp, but at that time they had no reason to suspect the full sinister story. That Kimball was a wanted man under other names, or that the child wasn't even really his own daughter. Rasmussen's reaction to the DUI was to change identities yet again. By 1986, he turned up about 350 miles north of Los Alamitos in Scotts Valley, California, near Santa Cruz. Here, he went by Gordon Jensen, and he and the child lived in the Holiday Host RV park where he found work as a handyman or general helper. By now, the little girl was 5 years old, and those around could clearly see that she was not being cared for properly. A kind-hearted woman named Catherine Decker, who lived in the trailer park, noticed that the child's clothes were faded and frayed and a few sizes too small, that she had no toys and was often hungry, and that she slept in the back of a pickup truck with her father, Jensen. Lisa gravitated toward Catherine Decker, even affectionately calling her grandma as she played with Decker's grandson. Rasmussen, as Jensen, spun a pitiful tale for the neighbors. He tearfully claimed that his wife, Lisa's mother, had died, leaving him a single father struggling to raise his daughter. In truth, of course, Lisa's mother, Denise, was very likely dead at Rasmussen's very own hands. But, of course, he omitted that detail. As the summer of 1986 wore on, Gordon Jensen's behavior aroused more suspicion. The Deckers grew increasingly worried about Lisa's well-being. Finally, in June 1986, he made a sudden move. He would abandon little Lisa altogether. He arranged for the Deckers family, their daughter and son-in-law, to take temporary custody of Lisa under the ruse that he had a job opportunity out of state and he would come back for her. But he never did. After a while, realizing Jensen had truly vanished, the family caring for Lisa alerted authorities. In a heartbreaking turn, the 5-year-old girl was placed into protective custody, essentially with foster care, without anyone knowing her true identity or origin. But I can't help but think that this actually might have saved her life. She became, as one detective later put it, a living Jane Doe. But authorities now had a little girl in their care who knew her name only as Lisa, and she believed the man who had abandoned her was her father. But they also had a crime to solve: child abandonment. So they began looking for the man known as Gordon Jensen. Fingerprints taken from items Jensen left behind were run through databases, and a match came back. Jensen's prints matched those of a Curtis Kimball, the man who had been arrested for a DUI with a child in 1985 and then just disappeared. This told police that Gordon Jensen and Curtis Kimball were one and the same. They still didn't know his real name, but at least they had linked two aliases. So a warrant was issued for child abandonment, but by then Rasmussen had had a huge head start. In fact, by the time law enforcement had pieced together the Jensen-Kimball connection in September of 1986, Rasmussen had already fled across the country. He didn't lay low for long, though. In November 1988, nearly 2 years later, he would pop up again on the police's radar, this time in San Luis, California, going by yet another name, Jerry Mockerman. He was pulled over while driving a vehicle that turned out to be stolen from Preston, Idaho. The name Mockerman didn't fool anyone for long. Once again, fingerprints revealed that he was the same individual previously known as Kimball and Jensen. Then in March 1989, California authorities finally arrested him on the outstanding charges related to abandoning Lisa. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison for child abandonment and some other related offenses. A child abuse charge was dropped, likely as part of some kind of plea deal. But during his incarceration from 89 to 90, the true identity of this man still remained a mystery to law enforcement. He served about a year and a half of his sentence, and in October 1990, Curtis Kimball was paroled, and astonishingly, He absconded immediately, essentially walking away and disappearing the day after his release. Once again, he melted into the ether. He was a fugitive. He had successfully avoided any reckoning for his far graver crimes, the murders, and had now even evaded supervision for the lesser crime of child abandonment. But the 90s for him are a bit of a blank canvas in the record, so it just goes to show how slippery he was. It's known that he remained in California, and by the late 90s, he was living under a new name, Lawrence William Larry Vanner, in the great San Francisco Bay Area. But where exactly he went in the early 90s or what he did is largely unknown. Investigators suspect that he might have continued targeting women during this time, given the gap in his known crime. And indeed, when they later reviewed the cold cases, one possible victim emerged, a woman known as the lady in the fridge. In 1995, scavengers discovered a refrigerator dumped in a canal in San Joaquin County, California, with a female body inside. She'd been beaten to death and left in the fridge. The victim was unidentified for decades, and only in 2023 was she identified through DNA as Amanda Schumann Deza. Former detective John Huber speculated that Rasmussen could have been responsible, noting the blunt force trauma cause of death and the timeline. There's no actual definitive proof tying Rasmussen to Deza's murder, but the possibility does kind of show that he very well may have killed others during his years on the run. As one law enforcement official said, "We suspect that he killed other people, but the true number of his victims will likely never be known." By December 1999, Terry had once again embedded himself into a community, this time in Richmond, California. Under the guise of Larry Vanner, he formed a relationship with Yutsun Jun, a 45-year-old chemist and doting aunt who had a wide circle of friends. Yunsun was described by those close to her as a kind, intelligent woman with a big heart. It's both chilling and poignant that even in the year 2000, long after he had become a killer, Terry could still charm a loving and accomplished woman into trusting him. She soon introduced Larry Vanner to her family and friends in 2000, describing him as her new boyfriend. They even held an unofficial wedding ceremony in 2001, symbolically committing to each other, although no legal marriage certificate was ever filed. Probably because Terry, was using a fake name. He was not a real person. Yunsun's friends, however, started to sense something was off about Larry Vanner. Renee Rose, one of her close friends, later recalled her impression. He didn't look healthy and his face was gray. He smoked constantly. Larry would just grab and gobble up everything on the table and belch and eat more, and then he'd go sit on the couch, Rose recounted, painting a picture of a man who was crude and far from charming in private. More concerningly, when Yoon Soon Jun suddenly vanished in June 2002, Vanner gave her friends a string of dubious excuses. He would say, well, she's busy taking care of her mom, or she went to get some therapeutic help. He even told some that she had decided she didn't want to be friends with them anymore. But none of it rang true. Rose would say, who could believe him for 1 second? And she became increasingly alarmed as weeks passed with no word from her friend. So finally, she confronted him. I want Yoonsoon, not you, she told him. I want her to tell me that she's done with our friendship or I'm going to get the sheriff involved, unquote. And I just think that's so incredibly brave. Because when Vanner could not produce Yoonsoon or a credible explanation for her absence, her friends reported her missing in the late summer of 2002. And the case landed on the desk of Detective Roxanne Grunheide of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office. She was a determined homicide detective who would soon play a pivotal role in unmasking the Chameleon Killer. Detective Roxanne found Larry Vanner to be polite and seemingly cooperative at first, but she knew something was not right. She said he was polite and soft-spoken and very smart with his twinkly blue eyes. He could get somebody to trust him. Yet his story about Yoonsoon's whereabouts kept changing. The detective's instincts told her that Vanner was hiding a terrible secret. On September 17, 2002, a search team entered Yoonsoon Jun's modest home in Richmond, a place that she had shared with Vanner. In the garage, amid typical storage items, the detective noticed an enormous pile of cat litter on the floor, a heap roughly 4 to 5 feet wide and 2 to 3 feet high. It was an odd thing. So much cat litter just poured out in one place, as if trying to cover something. When the detective saw it, her heart must have sunk when she realized what this meant. Because under that mound of litter, searchers found what looked like a human foot, mummified and still clad in a flip-flop sandal. As they carefully dug further, they uncovered the dismembered remains of Yoon Soon Jun, buried in cat litter to mask the smell of decay. She'd been bludgeoned to death. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, eerily consistent with Rasmussen's other murders. Her friends were devastated. The shock rippled through her social circle. All of these women who had held out hope that maybe she was alive somewhere. Renee Rose remembered the surreal contrast of nature carrying on around her as she learned that her dear friend was gone. Quote, "When I got up in the morning, I pulled my shades back. There were clouds and a beautiful blue sky, and there were seagulls circling in the sky. They were beautiful, and I went, this just can't be," she said. "I closed the blinds back up. How could it be bright and sunny when Yoon Soon's dead?" It was a poignant expression of grief. The world's ordinary beauty suddenly seemed wrong in the face of such loss. With Yoon Soon's body found, Larry Vanner was arrested in November 2002 for her murder. However, even as he sat in a California jail, the man gave investigators the slip in one final way. He refused to reveal his true identity. Charged as Larry Vanner, he eventually agreed to a plea deal. In 2003, he pleaded no contest to the murder and received a sentence of 15 to life in prison. The swift guilty plea surprised the court, but Detective Grunheid had a theory about it. She believed that Rasmussen overheard her discussing plans to pursue a paternity test for Lisa, the child that he'd abandoned, and realized that digging into his past might unearth far more. By pleading guilty, he may have hoped to shut down further investigations into his history. If that was his plan, it only partially worked. After his conviction, authorities fingerprinted Vanner and got a match to the prints of Curtis Kimball, the fugitive wanted since 1990 for parole violation. This linked Vanner to the 1980s child abandonment case, confirming to California authorities that their murderer was not who he claimed to be. Now they knew Vanner was Kimball, but the question remained, who was he really? In 2003, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction over the Lisa abandonment case, opened a fresh investigation to find Lisa's biological family. They now understood that the child had likely been kidnapped. A DNA test quickly confirmed what was suspected. Rasmussen was not Lisa's biological father. This meant that somewhere out there was a mother, and possibly other relatives, who had no idea what had become of their missing baby. The murderer, meanwhile, kept his secrets to the end. During his incarceration in California, Larry Vanner still did not divulge his real name or full story. To prison officials and fellow inmates, he was just another convict with a life sentence. On December 28, 2010, at 67, he died in prison from natural causes. At the time of his death, the name on his prison records was still one of his aliases. It would be nearly 7 years later, in 2017, before law enforcement, aided by the pursuit of truth and groundbreaking DNA technology, finally revealed who this chameleon really was. In the years following his 2003 conviction, the key to unraveling his true identity and connecting his crimes lay in the innocent person he left behind, the little girl known as Lisa. By 2013, the abandoned girl from 1986 was a grown woman in her 30s. She'd been adopted by a loving family in California and built a new life of her own, marrying and having children. Yet she never stopped wondering who she really was. She had no memories of her birth mother and had only learned as a young adult that the man who raised her briefly and abandoned her was not her biological father. The question, "Who am I?" loomed large in her life, and she was determined to find answers. Between 2014 and 15, advances in direct-to-consumer DNA testing were making it possible for adoptees and foundlings to trace their lineage through genetics. Lisa joined millions of others turning to DNA databases to trace their roots. She purchased an ancestry DNA kit, provided a saliva sample, and sent it off, hoping for matches that might lead her to her biological family. At the same time, Detective Peter Headley of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department was actively working her case. He'd been assigned to Lisa's case in 2013, recognizing that identifying her could be the key to larger mysteries. Headley reached out on an online forum with a question. Could the techniques adoptees use to find their birth families help identify a woman with absolutely no known family? His inquiry found its way to a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, a volunteer known as a search angel for helping people with DNA puzzles. Ray Venter had recently retired from her career as a patent attorney and had a passion for genetic genealogy. When she learned about Lisa's plight, she was confident that they could crack it, though she cautioned it wouldn't be easy. She assembled a small team of volunteers from the Monterey County Genealogy Society and dubbed the effort the Lisa Project. The process was arduous and groundbreaking. Lisa's ancestry DNA results came back showing thousands of distant relatives, but one match stood out: an 81-year-old man on the East Coast who shared a significant amount of DNA with her. This suggested that he might be a close relative, possibly a grandfather or great uncle. He agreed to share his results and also uploaded them to a site called GED Match, which allows comparisons across testing services. Ray Venter deduced that this man and Lisa shared a common female ancestor, but to identify which ancestor, they needed more relatives in the data. Lisa's DNA was also uploaded to 23andMe, where she found 3 close matches. Only one responded: Adam Keem, a 42-year-old man in San Francisco. Interestingly, Adam himself was adopted and searching for his biological parents, which was a fortuitous twist as both he and Lisa were looking for family. Ray Venter contacted Keem, explaining that he appeared to be a cousin of the woman they were calling Lisa. Though initially skeptical, Adam eventually agreed to help when assured that this was real and very important. In exchange, Ray Venter even offered to help him with his own family search. He provided his DNA matches and the limited information from his adoption records, which included his birth surname and birth date and place. In an astonishingly short time, Ray Venter's team traced Adam's lineage, found his birth name, and even located his birth mother living not far away. This success gave everyone encouragement, and indeed, also tied into Lisa's search. For Lisa, the genealogy team was building extensive family trees. They identified that her close 81-year-old match had a grandmother with 18 children. This meant Lisa's connection spanned a huge family network. Volunteers like Janelle Davidson combed through old records, tracing ancestors back to the 1600s and finding living descendants who might be tested. Detective Headley personally called hundreds of these potential relatives across the country, asking if they'd take DNA tests. Many refused or were skeptical, and some even hung up on him, fearing it was a scam. But Headley persisted, refining his approach and verifying his law enforcement credentials to assure people that this was legitimate. Bit by bit, more family members agreed, and the web of known relationships tightened. Lisa's family tree grew to encompass some 19,000 people on her maternal side. An enormous undertaking, but within that sprawl lay the answer. Eventually came the breakthrough. Among the countless names, one obituary that Janelle Davidson found stood out: an obituary for a woman named Georgette Beaudin, who died in 2008. It mentioned that she was survived by a daughter, Denise Beaudin. That name, Denise, had appeared nowhere else in records where it should. It was as if she just vanished after 1981. The genealogists were puzzled. Why did this Denise leave no footprint? Then came an insight that shattered the case open. They realized that some of Lisa's matches were related to each other in a way suggesting a collapse in the family tree. Specifically, that generations earlier, 2 brothers had married 2 sisters. This meant that Lisa's maternal and paternal sides, as defined by her DNA matches, actually intertwined in the same extended family. Once they saw this, everything clicked. There was only one woman who could be her mother, and that woman was Denise Beaudin. In July 2016, Detective Heatley made the call to the woman known as Lisa. He asked her if she'd like to know her name, and she said yes. The answer was Dawn. Dawn was the name Denise had given her baby at birth. For the first time in her memory, the former Lisa learned her real identity. She saw a copy of her birth certificate and the name of her mother, Denise of Manchester, New Hampshire. It was a moment of profound emotional impact, the end of one search, but the beginning of new questions. Dawn suddenly had relatives she never knew about, including her grandfather, Armand Beaudin. The now elderly Armand had lost contact with his only daughter in 1981 and never knew what became of her or his infant granddaughter. When first approached by investigators years prior, Armand had declined to give a DNA sample, not really understanding why it was needed. But when told in 2016 that his granddaughter had been found alive after 35 years, he was stunned. He immediately provided DNA, which confirmed beyond any shadow of a doubt that Dawn was his granddaughter. Armand told police about the last time he saw Denise, which was Thanksgiving 1981, and how a week later, when a family dropped by her house, she, the baby, and her boyfriend, Bob Evans, were gone. He reiterated that he hadn't reported her missing due to believing the couple left for financial reasons. For New Hampshire's authorities, this was explosive information. A missing persons case from 1981 that had never been officially opened because no report was filed had now landed in their laps. The Manchester Police and New Hampshire State Police were alerted that Denise had likely been murdered decades ago, and her boyfriend, Bob Evans, was the top suspect. Even more strikingly, when Manchester detectives dug into their archives, they found Bob Evans' mugshots from 1980 arrests, and when placed side by side with California mugshots of Curtis Kimball and Larry Vanner, it was clearly the same man. The Chameleon Killer's house of cards was finally collapsing. New Hampshire's cold case unit, led by Assistant Attorney General Jeff Strelzin, realized that they might have a serial killer on their hands who spanned from New Hampshire to California. Then came another aha moment. One of the staff at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, hearing about the Bob Evans connection and knowing the geography, pointed out that Manchester, New Hampshire is only about 15 miles from Allenstown, the site of the Bear Brook barrels. Could it be? Could Bob Evans be linked to the Allenstown murders of the 4 females? The more they cross-referenced, the more it made sense. Bob Evans had worked at Wambeck Mill in Manchester from 77 to 81. Notably, his boss at the mill owned the very property where the barrels were found. Evans had even done electrical work on that property and used the land to dispose of waste from the mill. This put him intimately familiar with the location of the murders. Additionally, the dismemberment observed on 2 of the Bear Brook victims recalled the dismemberment of Yoon Soon Jun, which suggested a similar brutality and established a pattern of behavior. And of course, DNA now showed Bob Evans fathered the unidentified 2 to 4-year-old victim in Allenstown. The constellation of evidence pointed squarely at Rasmussen. In January 2017, New Hampshire authorities made a public announcement that sent ripples through the true crime community. The long elusive killer in the Bear Brook murders had been identified as the same person responsible for Denise's disappearance and likely death. They revealed that Bob Evans was a pseudonym, and while they didn't yet have his real name, they did have his DNA and they knew he was deceased. They appealed for help in finding his true identity, releasing an old mugshot video of him in June 2017 to the public. The case that had once seemed hopelessly stalled was now cracking wide open. Investigators openly stated that they feared there were more victims of this man beyond the ones known. They also acknowledged that without the breakthroughs in DNA and genealogy, they might never have connected these dots. The public was stunned. A serial killer responsible for one of New England's notorious cold cases had also been active on the West Coast, and no one knew for decades because he just kept changing his name? The final step was to identify Bob Evans' actual identity. Traditional detective work hadn't yielded any information yet. There were no fingerprints and national databases that tied him to the name Rasmussen, and he lied so much that even his age was initially unclear. But genetic genealogy came to the rescue once more. In August 2017, utilizing a Y DNA sample from one of Rasmussen's adult sons from his first legitimate marriage, forensic genealogists managed to zero in on a family tree in Colorado and Arizona. They discovered that Bob Evans was, in fact, Terry Peder Rasmussen, born December 23, 1943, in Colorado. The New Hampshire authorities announced his identity on August 18, 2017, finally reconciling all aliases under one true name. The use of genetic genealogy to identify him was pioneering. It was among the first high profile cases where the technique was used to unmask an unknown suspect. It demonstrated a new possibility in forensic investigations. With his identity confirmed, investigators continued working to name his victims. It took until June 2019 for the next big revelation. Using DNA profiling and genealogical research, New Hampshire authorities announced that 3 of the 4 victims in the barrels were Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch and her daughters Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters. Relatives from Marlise's family, including her siblings who had never stopped wondering what happened to her, were located to provide confirmation. At long last, these 2 little girls and their mother had their names reclaimed. Family members traveled from across the country to New Hampshire for the press conference, where they sat together, tears in their eyes, as officials shared the news. Though they chose not to speak publicly that day, they provided a statement. Marlise, Marie, and Sarah were so loved by our families, and they are greatly missed. We take solace in finally having the answers we have longed for. This day comes with heavy hearts. The audience could feel the mix of sorrow and relief in those words. Sorrow for the lives cut short, relief that they were no longer lost to history. That left the final unidentified victim, Rasmussen's own biological daughter, still unnamed as of 2019. The search for her identity, and by extension her mother's, persisted. Decades after her small body was found, she deserved to be known. In early 2024, the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit partnered with the nonprofit DNA Doe Project to apply the most advanced genetic genealogy techniques yet. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. They had to triangulate DNA matches for a child whose father was a known serial killer and whose mother was completely unknown. But after painstaking research, in September of this year, authorities finally announced a major breakthrough. The middle child now had a name, Rhea Rasmussen, born in 1976 in Orange County. They also identified her mother as Pepper Elizabeth Reed, born in 1952 in Texas, who disappeared in the late 1970s. This meant that Pepper Reed is almost certainly another victim of Terry's. It was a case that took 40 years to solve. And thanks to technological advancements and a better understanding of DNA and science, we've been able to solve it. My heart goes out to all the families affected by this terrible tragedy. I don't even know if I would feel relieved after 40 years of wondering, or if I would not want to relive some of that trauma. But I feel like it has to be closure for all of these families. And I really hope that they've all been able to move on and have really fulfilling, wonderful lives. I'm so curious about what y'all think about today's video. It makes me so fascinated about DNA and how it's literally like a web that you have to put back together, this like massive, massive 100,000 piece puzzle. It's truly, truly incredible when I really step back and think about it. And it really makes me appreciate those who fight for years to bring justice to victims of people like Terry. So thank you guys all so much for watching. I'm so eager to hear what you think about today's video. And please stay safe out there. Ask questions and always stay skeptical. I'll see you in my next video soon. Bye.